If you have around a 2000, 2002, 3 model DRZ400S, you may find that it's running lean. And there's many forums out there that talk about having to adjust the air idle screw, but there may be another issue. So let's look at this video and see what I gotta do. So with this motorcycle, this DRZ400, it's really common for them to start running lean, and you have to run it with a choke on, or adjust the air idle mixture screw. But sometimes the issue isn't actually that, or not necessarily the carburetor like you would think. I've read a lot of forums where people say that it was running fine, and then just gradually, gradually, it started running bad, or it just all of a sudden started running bad. So they started adjusting the air screw and messing around with things like that. And I think there's a diaphragm you can grind the stem off of to help it. But you may, before you do all this stuff and mess with the carburetor, you might want to check the Petcock valve. It's brought to me because the cooling system overheating. Customer changed out the radiator, but he didn't get the air burped out of it, so I got that problem solved. But he told me the battery was weak and that you had to keep the battery charged in order to start it. And so I started looking on all the forums, and a lot of them give you, and I'll focus in on this, give you all these instructions on this carburetor right here, and that there's a right here, see that pointing right down, there is a air mixture screw in there, and I can't say that that's not what you would have to do to adjust it, but everybody's been talking about turning it out to enriching the mixture. And I saw some forums saying, hey, my bike was running great, then it started, not wanting to run very well, and so I had to get that and adjust that screw, and now it runs like a top. This bike here won't hardly run unless the choke's pulled out, and I really couldn't figure out why. And then I realized that this bike, like a lot of them, has, let me see if I can get on this Petcock right here. On the Petcock, right here in the back is a vacuum diaphragm. Now what that does is whenever you pull whenever it's pulling a vacuum, it opens up the fuel so it can run into the carburetor. And these things go bad all the time. So I thought I was going to replace that, because this Petcock valve does not have a stop. The up, when you turn it up, it's prime, which means it just runs fuel straight out of the tank. It's probably out of the bottom. So if you ran on prime all the time and you run out of gas, you're out of gas. And of course you've got reserve, and then you've got regular. So I have to put this thing on prime in order to run it with the choke on. And if you flip it off, then if you turn the choke off, it quits running. Now there still may be an air mixture screw, and I may still have to do some work on it, but I did notice one thing. This vacuum line is supposed to be to that diaphragm. It's not plugged in, so this valve can't work anyways. It's a straight vacuum leak. So we're going to plug this up and see if that makes things a little better. And people are talking about how their motorcycles have been running great, and then either just kind of a quick gradual change or just an instant change, then all of a sudden they're having to enrich it or run it with a choke on and stuff like that. And it could be the carburetor's got off, because as motorcycles age, things change, and you do have to readjust the air fuel mixture. But another thing that people don't realize is these Petcocks, this Petcock valve right here, it's vacuum operated. It has a vacuum line, and I've got the vacuum line pulled off right now. Let me see if I can get to the focusing of it here. Look on it. That little vacuum line right there. The engine vacuum pulls a diaphragm that opens up the fuel flow to it. See, right now it's on, and you can see there's no fuel coming out of the line. It's because there's no vacuum on it. And you can turn it to reserve. So now I've got it turned over to reserve. There's no gas coming out of the line. However, because this valve does not have an off, but it does have up the top says PRI, that's prime. So basically what that's for is if your tank, or if your bike's run out of gas or it's been sitting around and the carburetor's dry of gas, you're going to have to crank it a lot so it can pull a vacuum on that valve while it's cranking and let fuel into the carburetor enough to start. If you've got a weak battery, you'll kill out the battery before you get it started. So what they did is they designed a prime, and I'm going to turn this thing up to prime, but I want to show you here the fuel line. You can see it starts squirting gas. And you could run the bike on prime. The only thing is you won't have a reserve. It'll just drain all the gas right out of the bottom of the tank, and then when you're out, you're out. What can happen on this valve is if the diaphragm is starting to get weak or leaking a little of gas. One, if it's leaking gas, so back to that diaphragm, if you put your finger over that vacuum line, or that little stem sticking out for the vacuum, and it's got gas on it, that means your diaphragm's gone bad. But the other test is it pulling in enough? So I'm putting a little vacuum pump. Now granted, if you don't have to have one of these vacuum pumps, you could just use your mouth and a hose and suck it. But right now it's on reserve. So let's see if we can. I'm gonna put a little vacuum on it. And it's not letting any out. So on reserve, with the vacuum pulled on that diaphragm, it's not letting any fuel out. So I'll decrease the vacuum. Now I'll put it over onto, regular on. And now I'll pull the vacuum. See, it's coming out really good. If it's coming out like drops like that, the vacuum, then the diaphragm is not pulling it enough to give it fuel. I've got to look into this, find out why the reserve isn't working. That means the only thing he's got is on and not reserve. So anyways, now let's go back to this. If it's on prime, it'll pour gas. If you have it on and you put a vacuum on there, it pours gas. So the trick is, or what you want to look for is, it needs to be putting gas out of that line, or pouring gas out of that line the same as it would if it's on prime. If not, there's a filter right here that you have to pull out. It's a screen filter. You just unscrew this little bowl and there's a screen there, and you clean that. And like I said, if your fuel flow is weakened because of that diaphragm, that'll cause your carburetor to run lean and you'll have to enrichen it. So before you start going and messing with all the adjustments and stuff, ensure that your fuel supply is enough to make the bike run correctly. It's real common for these bikes to have a vacuum diaphragm fuel shutoff. In other words, you'll find a vacuum line running to the petcock, and what that does, there's a little diaphragm that when it has a little bit of vacuum, it pulls a stem and opens up the fuel supply to the carburetor. If you'll notice on these petcocks, they do not have a stop. It doesn't have a shutoff. It has a prime, which means it bypasses that diaphragm and just runs fuel straight out to the carburetor the whole time. And yes, you can run the motorcycle on that, but when you run out of gas, you're out of gas. You don't have a reserve. So the whole idea is that way you don't have to worry about shutting the fuel off every night. When you turn the motorcycle off, that valve shuts and the fuel stops going to the carburetor, so you have to worry about a float sticking. So in this case, I did some checking and I found that the diaphragm does work and let the fuel out. However, this petcock has problems because it's not working on reserve. So I've checked the screen, the fuel filter screen, and all that's good. So it probably needs a petcock valve rebuilt. And what I'm going to do is all the information I find out on this petcock, if you can buy a new petcock or buy a rebuild kit, I'll put that down in the description so that you can check that out. But I did use a little handheld vacuum pump to pull vacuum on that diaphragm, but you don't have to. It doesn't take a lot. You can just take a piece of neoprene tube, stick onto the vacuum line, and suck on it with your mouth, and that'll be enough to get it to flow. But that's something you need to check into before you start messing with the carburetor. So I hope this video helped you, and if it did, be sure to leave me a comment telling me what your situation is. Maybe I can help you. So if you like the video, be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.